All right, it's now time to talk about a concept called generalizability. You may remember from many lectures ago when I posed this issue of what is the question, right? What are you studying? Are you studying the right thing? Well, generalizability is somewhat related. In the case of generalizability, we're assuming you've got the right question and you're collecting the data in the right way, but the people you're asking, the population, might not be the right population. So let me walk you through some of the goals. Today we're going to discuss the concept of generalizability and how it relates to sampling. We're going to explain how generalizability problems come in several flavors and remind you that just because a study does not generalize does not mean the findings aren't more broadly true. So to give a brief example of this, let's say that I want to figure out a good book to read this summer. I want to know, something that's going to be really entertaining that a lot of people like. So I'm going to go out on the street and I'm going to ask people what they've been reading. We're here on the lovely Yale campus. It's a beautiful spring day, and we're trying to figure out what the hottest book of the summer is going to be. We are taking a sample of the students around here to find out what those exciting, page-turning beach reads are going to be. I'm here with Kendall. Kendall, what book are you reading right now?
Native Son by Richard Wright.
Totally. So what book are you reading right now?
I read nerd stuff, like reinforcement learning and introduction is what I'm reading at the moment.
That's a classic. What book are you reading right now?
Montaigne's Essays.
That's a good one.
I am reading On Deep History and the Human Brain by, who is this by? Oh, Daniel Smale.
Dawn by Octavia Butler.
I've actually heard of that book. I think that's the first time this has happened. What book are you reading right now?
I'm not reading a book right now, but I just finished Homegoing by Ya Nagase.
I'm reading a book called Brain on Fire by Susanna Kaelin right now.
I don't know what that is. What book are you reading right now?
So I'm actually currently reading How Democracies Die.
Very depressing.
I started reading Joseph Campbell's The Hero with 1,000 Faces.
Classic.
I'm reading Difficult Women by Roxane Gay, a collection of short stories.
Oh, that sounds like a lot of fun. What book are you reading right now?
Chronicle of a Death Foretold by Gabriel Garcia Marquez.
Good old GGM.
Yeah.
Okay, so what was the problem there? We asked a good question, right? What are you reading? I wanted to get some book recommendations for my beach read this summer, but I asked the wrong people. My sample was not representative of the population I was interested in. The population I was interested in was like regular people in the United States, but we ended up walking around campus here and talking to a bunch of college students who are reading things that really don't sound that interesting. So good question, data accurately collected, but not really generalizable. It doesn't, the sample that we obtained is not representative of the sample I'm interested in. So this is a generalizability problem. The results I got are accurate, but not terribly useful. So let's talk about some broad generalizability issues in the context of a few different studies. So the first one, the study population is too specific when you need a more general population. So here's this study, effects of oral versus transdermal estrogen therapy on sexual function in early postmenopause. So this was a study asking if you could give hormone replacement therapy like estrogen just after menopause to increase sexual function in women. So an interesting and important question. You might think that this is something that would have broad applicability to a large number of people in the United States. But if you dig in and you look at the inclusion and exclusion criteria, women were only included if they were 42 to 58 years old. They were 6 months to 36 months from their last menstrual period. Their blood level of follicle-stimulating hormone was at least 35. They hadn't had a hysterectomy. They hadn't had an abnormal mammogram. They had no untreated psychiatric illness, no history of cardiovascular disease, no smoking, no obesity, and so on, and so on, and so on. This highly selected population. So they're asking a really interesting question, and one that's important, but they're asking it of this really specific group. And I challenge you to find a woman in your own life that would meet all of the inclusion and exclusion criteria for this study. So how do we interpret that data? It's accurate insofar as a woman matches up with these characteristics, but if there are so few women that match these characteristics, what are we really doing with that? This study does not generalize well. But it's important to know that just because a study doesn't generalize well doesn't mean you can always throw it in the waste paper basket. A lot of times studies start out with very specific populations, the initial studies in an area, for example, and then they get broader and broader and broader over time. So a great example of this is a study published all the way back in 1954, we're in Mad Men era now, okay, looking at the mortality of doctors in relation to their smoking habits. This is a very specific population. As a doctor myself, I can tell you that we're very strange and unusual people. Nevertheless, what they found is that the more doctors smoked, in this sort of dose-response mechanism here, the more doctors smoked, the higher the incidence of lung cancer was. So this was one of the first studies in America that suggested that there might actually be a link between smoking and lung cancer. Now, if I was looking at this back then, I might say, oh, those are just doctors. This doesn't generalize to the general population. This is only true for doctors for some reason. But if you think about it, why? What makes doctors that different, aside from the fact that we're just strange people? So, important study, turned out to be true generally, even though this study itself was quite specific. I also want to point out, one of the authors of this study was Bradford Hill. You remember in our causality lecture, we talked about the Bradford Hill criteria for causality. So this guy was important, turns out. Okay, what if we study the wrong population entirely? Not just a specific subset of the population we're interested in, but just the wrong people altogether. So this happens sometimes too. So here's an article called Stimulation of the Prefrontal Cortex Reduces Intentions to Commit Aggression. So you read that, okay, what you need to know, the prefrontal cortex is part of the brain, and aggression is aggression, okay. So just from the title alone, this is a study looking at whether you can sort of stimulate this part of the brain, and I'm not sure whether it's with electricity or magnetism or something like that, but you're going to stimulate this part of the brain, and it's going to reduce aggressive impulses. So that's kind of cool. It's like a little scary, I guess, maybe a little creepy. What population do you want to test this in? Well, the population of interest is probably people with aggressive impulses. You might even argue it should be maybe like violent offenders, people in prison for violent crimes or something like that. That's the interesting population. Now, what they studied, what you can see here, is 81 healthy subjects. And indeed, they showed that this stimulation, it reduced their intent to commit physical assault and intent to commit sexual assault, which of course leads you to that question, which is like, who are these 81 healthy volunteers who at baseline are like, well, I'd like to commit a little sexual assault. So I'm not entirely sure who these people are, but it's not the right population. Okay, so this is an interesting study. It's suggestive, but if you were reading this, you would say, okay, that's great, but I'm not really interested in giving electric shocks to healthy people to help them control their latent urges to physically assault someone. Really, if I'm going to do this kind of strange thing at all, I'm going to do it to someone that has a documented history of having these urges. Wrong population. The most extreme example of wrong population happens quite often in the news media. So here's a study called Eradication of Spontaneous Malignancy by Local Immunotherapy. That sounds good. Spontaneous malignancy, that's cancer. Local immunotherapy, that sounds like they're injecting something near the cancer to sort of boost the immune system and have it fight the cancer. Really cool. Studies like this often show up in the news media as like the latest cure for cancer, which you should always be skeptical about. And in fact, the conclusion here was that a cancer vaccine, as it was described, eliminated 97% of distant metastases. So really exciting data in mice. Okay, that's the biggest generalizability problem of all. Mice aren't humans. The population you want to cure cancer in is humans. Unless you're maybe a veterinarian for mice. So be aware, we want to study humans whenever possible if we're going to make conclusions about how best to treat humans. So that is generalizability. Your take-home points today, whether a study generalizes is somewhat subjective. You want to ask who is the population you're interested in and who is the population they studied. Remember, just because a study doesn't generalize doesn't mean you should completely throw it away. It doesn't mean it won't generalize in the future. And often early studies start in specific populations. You start in healthy controls before you move on to the sicker population. And maybe the most important thing, mice aren't human. So always look very skeptically at studies that show dramatic results in mice. They rarely generalize to the human population. Thanks, I'll see you next time.